Mr. Nicholson, sorry for the delay. Thanks for being with us today.
Very good to be here. You're a little bit soft.
How about now? Better?
That's good. Thank you. Yes, that's good.
Okay, perfect. First of all, congratulations on your film. It's a really nice film. I enjoyed it very much. Somehow it gave me hope. I mean, hope is in the title, and hope is what. Was that an intention of yours?
I guess so. I think what I was most keen on was giving truth, but I've got a feeling that any contact with truth is actually hopeful, because when you feel you're dealing with the real thing as opposed to somebody's fantasy or projection or lies, then you feel if it's real, if that's how it really is, I can work with this. I can get somewhere with this. The ending is not exactly hopeful in the sense that neither of the characters look as if their lives is going to be perfect. But I hope what you felt was they had both of them started to deal with reality.
Mm-hmm. And with grief. How would you describe what happens with love when you're beyond 60, let's say?
Well, I think it differs with the genders. I think that for a woman over 60, it's very difficult to find another partner. Not impossible, but difficult to find another partner. For a man of the same age, it's a great deal easier. And this is just a sad truth. Perhaps this will change as time goes by. But it's tougher if you're a woman who is left at the age of 60 than if you're a man.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like accurate. I was really delighted with dialogues in the. I think they were clever and they were accurate in depicting the three main characters. How difficult do you find putting the roles in the right moment in every character? I mean, in this movie, it seems particularly important.
It is. I mean, dialogue is character entirely. So when I'm writing it, I have to be that person when that person is speaking. So the ideal dialogue is not a fine writing line. It's something that seems to come inevitably from that person at that moment. And if you get it right, the audience, as they become familiar with the characters, could almost themselves say what those characters are likely to say. And so that's the goal, is to make it feel so natural, so inevitable, that it is just real. And of course, in this case, this is autobiographical. I'm basing it on my parents and myself. So I've got a great deal to call upon when I'm thinking about how they're likely to speak.
Mm-hmm. And how have you dealt with the gap of time between the real story and the story you depict in the film? Because there's a time gap, right?
Yes, there is, very much so. These events happened when I was in my late 20s, so a long time ago. I mean, it's interesting question. In one sense, I've ignored it. I've set it today, but they are saying the things that they said then. But I've also obviously had to think about what would be there are all sorts of things that are different today, which I've had to change. And I've done my best to do it. But, I think this sort of thing is timeless. So when I read the love problems of characters in a Tolstoy novel, it can be as immediate to me as something that's happening today. I think if you can reach the truth about how people deal with each other, then that should transcend any particular time period.
Yeah, maybe yes, but I was thinking about your parents, and I was thinking that you had the lack of having two highly educated parents. I don't know if you placed this story in a home or family of a different, I don't know, extract. Would it be different?
Yes, of course. But the key message of what's coming through in my film is that here are two people who have projected onto each other the person they want the other person to be, rather than seen the truth of that other person. And that's the source of the problem. So she thinks that her husband is a certain type of man, which he isn't, and he thinks she's a certain type of woman, which she isn't. And that happened when they were young. And it's been sitting there like a kind of bomb waiting to blow up all these years. Now, that situation, I don't see why that couldn't happen in a very different social context. And I know cultures are very different and the pressures on people are very different. For example, my characters, there's a whole issue of the Catholic religion, which is part of it. But I don't see why you couldn't read that if you were a Muslim, or if you were an atheist, or if you were whatever, because essentially the same things happened. This is my belief anyway. The same things happen to people. And our duty as storytellers is not to be universal, but to be particular, to be specific, because it's through the specific detail that things come alive and become true. And the audience, I hope, would then translate that into their own experience. So, for example, if you're a young man whose parents split up when you were an adult, in completely different places to my places, you might say, I felt that same pressure to make my parents happy and that same self-blame when I failed to make them happy that you show in your movie, even though our worlds are so different.
How about writing and directing your film, doing those two important tasks? Do they make more difficult to cast a film, or is it easier? Because maybe you wrote thinking of certain names and then you didn't get them, or you did. Just tell us.
I never ever write thinking of particular actors. Never. It's actually, that's not quite true. I was a long time ago asked to write a film for Jack Nicholson, and so that was obviously with him in mind. But usually I don't, because you can't be sure you'll get that actor. So it's just foolishness to base yourself on that. What you do instead is you try and write a great character, and you hope that there will be actors who are drawn to it. Because, as you know, in order to finance a film, you often need to get actors with a certain name value in order to bring the money in. So no, I didn't. I write for the truth of the characters, and then the script is finished, and then the casting begins. But I'm very, very glad as director to be able to cast my own script, because I've suffered in the past from writing scripts, which of course other people direct, and they cast with a different attitude to me, and I just have to bite my lip and be quiet.
And what about directing? Is it easier to direct a script that you wrote?
Yeah, well, I've never directed one that I haven't written, so
I know.
But yes, I mean, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a huge privilege, and I love it, and I would do it all the time if I could. But there are certain types of story where I don't have the skills to direct. And this one, when I wrote it very consciously for myself to direct, and thought about every single aspect of how I would direct it. Though even then, I have to say, I relied very heavily on the cinematographer to help me, and the designer, and the first assistant, and a number of professionals who know exactly what they're doing. So my job was to say, this is what I want, how do I get it? And they would then help me with that, which is the glory of filmmaking, you know. I mean, I want to say to anybody who's a writer, don't be frightened of directing your own film. You can do it because you will have so many people helping you.
You mentioned your skills. You said, I don't have the skills to direct every film I write. Which skills? How would you define your skills?
I think my skills are mostly in the area of emotional delivery. So writing characters who can articulate emotions, and directing actors to then articulate those emotions. I think I have those skills. The kind of skills I'm thinking of, I mean, I've just written a screenplay called 13 Lives, which will be directed by Ron Howard. And he has knowledge and capacity to create sequences. This is about the boys who got stuck in a cave in Thailand. Now, when you're shooting underwater sequences and there's complicated technical job to be done, I just don't have the experience to do that. I wouldn't ever do a thriller, for example, or something very fast paced where it's all about really remarkable camera work, camera angles, cutting, and so forth. I just don't know about that, but I do know about two people sitting in a room breaking their hearts.
I know. Would you consider yourself part of the Hollywood system?
A little bit, yes. And to a certain extent, I regret that. I mean, many years ago, when I had my first film, I got an Oscar nomination on it, my very first one that I wrote. And immediately that meant I got a lot of work in Hollywood, which I was very grateful for. And it has been very worthwhile in money terms to me. But many of the films I wrote didn't get made. And when I look back, I regret that. I think maybe I should have stayed in England and done much smaller films and seen them get made and learned a lot more from that. But, you know, you win and you lose. So I'm not going to complain. But I do know a lot of people in Hollywood, and I've been there quite a lot, and I've written a lot of Hollywood films. So yeah, I'm part of it.
And what do you think about the changes we are seeing now in Hollywood? The landscape is shifting somehow. Due to the quarantine and the lockdown, but not only about that. I mean, it has maybe accelerated some process that were in motion. I'm talking about the possible death of the cinema venues like we know them. I'm talking about diversity. I'm talking about the gender gap. How do you see Hollywood changing now?
It is changing a lot, and streaming is the big change. Now there are so many deep-pocketed companies able to buy up the best talent to go onto the streaming channels. And that means that we're starting to be able to explore stories at length. You can have a 10-part, 12-part, 30-part stories, different lengths. All of that is opening up the opportunities for people like me in an extremely exciting way. And I think that has to be good at every level. The bad news is, as you say, the possible collapse of cinemas. And I regret that enormously. I think the joint experience of an audience sitting in the dark and watching a screen on a big film is extremely powerful and completely different to the experience of streaming it at home. So I think what's going to happen is there isn't going to be so much money for those films that are destined for the cinema. But actually, you know, that's been the case for a while. It was very difficult to raise money for my film, and it was £4 million it cost to make, which is not much. Difficult to raise that because it was destined for cinema showing, and to get your money back on that has become quite difficult now. So the big tentpole pictures do make a lot of money, although who knows what the future is there. But for the little dramas, the kind of thing I'm interested in, I think we are going to have to go to the small screen. I think that's going to be our fate. But look at the incredible variety of material that's now coming at us, and that's really exciting.
How would you describe this process of financing a film? Because many people listening to us, I'm sure, they are not aware of the difficulties you have to build a project. I mean, someone with your career, with your name, with your titles behind you, how would you describe it?
It's extremely difficult. The first thing you have to do, obviously, is have a script. So you write the script, and let's assume that people like the script. Then you've got to get actors to say they will act it who are familiar names enough. They don't have to be huge stars, but to give reassurance to the people who are going to back that project with money, because they're saying to themselves, how am I going to sell this? And they can only sell it by saying all around the world, well, it's got Annette Bening, and you've heard of her. It's got Bill Nye and you've heard of him. So you need that stage 2 is to get a cast to commit to it. And then stage 3, you then go to raise the money. And that's a very long and complicated process, which may not happen. And you have to budget it, and you have to convince them that you can actually make the film. I mean, my film at 4 million meant it was a 5-week shoot. And so we had to be sure we could do it in that time, because think of it this way. If you're an investor, why would you spend money on a project which will either collapse or be bad and lose you all your money? And most investors do lose their money in cinema. So it's very difficult. If you're a studio and you have a large pot of money to play with, then it's different. But for the rest of us making independent films, it's a tricky process and a very uncertain process. And I think that we should regard producers who handle this process with a lot more respect than we do, because they get paid nothing until the film actually happens. And for them to be able to find the money, put it together with the director, the cast, the script, it's a difficult business.
It is. Speaking about this film Hope Gap, in which you helm the whole thing, the whole project, leaving aside the writing process, right? Which of the other processes, like shooting or editing or the color or the casting or maybe the promotion, did you enjoy the most, or are you enjoying the most?
I think I would say the shooting. The casting I did enjoy. That was fairly straightforward. And I was in charge of it, which of course was wonderful, because for once I was able to match the actors to my mental image, which doesn't usually happen in my films. But the actual shooting, I really, really loved it. I was very closely collaborating with the cinematographer, and who's called Anna Valdez-Hanks. And she and we talked a lot about the look of it. We looked at clips from other films. We looked at photographs. We exchanged views on how we wanted the imagery to be. I was very keen on it having a kind of a rather cool, rather classical framing look, often symmetrical, and the exact opposite of a kind of film that jumps around a lot. So we were looking all the time for ways to frame, because it's really just 2 people in a room or 3 people in a room talking, ways to frame it that would have power. And I began to realize all sorts of things, like the less visual information you put in a frame, the more power the frame has, which is why black and white films are often so powerful. You don't want to see everything in a frame. You want to get your audience to be looking the way you want them to look. And we were shooting it in CinemaScope, in widescreen, which is wonderful because you waste 3/4 of that frame deliberately. You use it as space to direct the attention where you want it. And I spent a lot of time looking for angles and shots. It sounds ridiculous, but there's a shot of a train coming into the town, and there's just one place where you can get that angle, whether you get a strip of land, a strip of the train going past, a strip of sea, and a strip of sky. And it just goes through, and then we have to wait for the train to come. And that gives me great pleasure. I mean, I have no idea why, and I don't know why I bother really, but I spent a lot of time working on that. And then, of course, there's lighting. And lighting is a huge creative area that I'd never been in before. So I'm working with Anna, the cinematographer, and with our gaffer, who was also a woman, and doing the lighting. And I felt honestly like I was painting pictures. Well, I wasn't. We were. It was a combined job. You know, a little bit more here, a little bit less there, and so on. And because it was all done on a set, all the interior of the house was a set. So we had huge control, which was deliberate. So all of that, for me, I'm a word person. I live as a writer. For me, this was like emerging into a whole new creative life.
You seem to be learning and you seem to be enjoying it. So it's delightful to hear it. It's delightful. So, Mr. Nicholson, thank you very much for being with us, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.